Picture this. You're standing in your childhood living room, watching your sister blow out candles on what's supposed to be your birthday cake, when she looks you dead in the eye and announces to the entire family that you're their biggest disappointment. Now, imagine having the perfect comeback locked and loaded. My name is Rachel Martinez, and what happened next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scent of my mother's famous tres leches cake should have been comforting, but instead it felt like mockery floating through our cramped living room in East Los Angeles. 27 years old, and I was still getting birthday parties that somehow became celebrations of my younger sister Carmen's latest mediocre achievement. The fairy lights Dad had strung up last Christmas still hung crooked from the popcorn ceiling, casting uneven shadows across relatives who barely remembered my name, but never missed an opportunity to comment on my life choices. Carmen perched on the edge of our old sectional sofa like she was holding court, her freshly highlighted hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. She'd just finished telling everyone about her new job at the bank, a part-time teller position that Mom had been bragging about for weeks, like Carmen had just been elected president. The same relatives who used to whisper about Carmen's drinking problem and her string of failed relationships now nodded along enthusiastically as she described her responsibilities, which apparently included counting money and asking people if they wanted their receipt. I stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a paper plate with a slice of cake I hadn't touched, watching this familiar theater play out. My cousin Tony was going on about how proud the family should be, how Carmen was really turning her life around this time. Aunt Rosa kept patting Carmen's hand and saying things like, "Finally, Mia, finally you're on the right track." Uncle Miguel raised his beer and toasted our Carmen for showing us all what determination looks like. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the past 4 years, I'd been working at Community Health Partners, a medical nonprofit that served the underinsured populations across Los Angeles County. I'd started as a program assistant fresh out of grad school, making barely enough to cover my student loans and the rent on my studio apartment in Silver Lake. While Carmen was cycling through boyfriends and retail jobs, I was pulling 16-hour days writing grant proposals, coordinating with medical providers, and building systems to help families access healthcare they couldn't afford. But nobody asked about my work. Nobody wondered why I'd been too busy to attend Carmen's birthday dinner last month, or why I'd missed Easter, or why I always seemed distracted during family gatherings. They saw my serious demeanor, my practical clothes, my lack of dramatic relationship updates, and they'd quietly written me off as the responsible but boring daughter who'd never amount to anything exciting. Carmen caught my eye from across the room and smiled that smile I knew too well, the one that said she was about to say something that would cut deep, but sound innocent enough that I'd look petty if I reacted. She raised her voice just enough to make sure everyone could hear. "You know what I love about this family," she said, gesturing around the room with her plastic fork. "We're all so supportive of each other, even when some of us take longer to figure things out." Her eyes locked on mine. "I mean, look at Rachel renting that tiny place, still single, still working at that little clinic nobody's ever heard of. But hey, at least she's consistent, right?" Consistently the family disappointment. The conversation died like someone had turned off a radio. Cousin Sophia's laugh caught in her throat. Dad's hand froze halfway to his mouth. Mom's eyes went wide, darting between Carmen and me like she was watching a tennis match she didn't want to see. I felt the familiar heat of humiliation start to rise in my chest, the same feeling I'd carried since childhood whenever Carmen's shine made me invisible. But this time, something else rose with it. Something calm and certain and utterly unshakable. I reached into my purse and pulled out the letter I'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, with an embossed logo that most people wouldn't recognize but that carried serious weight in my world. "Actually, Carmen," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I have some news to share." I unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch. Everyone's attention shifted to me, probably expecting some defensive explanation or awkward attempt to change the subject. "This came on Tuesday," I continued, holding up the letter so they could see the official letterhead. I've been promoted to Regional Medical Director for Community Health Partner. I'll be overseeing healthcare access programs for the entire Southwest region, California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable pause after Carmen's insight. This was the silence of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about someone. Dad leaned forward, squinting at the letter like it might disappear if he looked away. Regional Director, Rachel. What does that mean exactly? It means I'll be managing a department of 87 medical professionals and administrators across 4 states. It means I'll oversee an annual budget of $14.2 million. It means I'll be responsible for healthcare programs that serve over 200,000 low-income families. Carmen's plastic fork clattered to her plate. That's not. Rachel, you never said anything about being promoted. You work at a clinic. I work at the largest nonprofit healthcare organization on the West Coast. I corrected gently. The little clinic nobody's ever heard of operates 15 full-service medical centers, 4 mobile health units, and 3 emergency response teams. We're the primary healthcare provider for migrant workers, undocumented immigrants, and families living below the poverty line across the Southwest. Aunt Rosa's mouth opened and closed without sound. Uncle Miguel lowered his beer bottle slowly, staring at me, like I'd just revealed I was actually a space alien. But why didn't you tell us? Mom asked, her voice small and confused. Rachel, this is incredible news. Why would you keep this secret? I looked around the room at faces that suddenly seemed smaller, more uncertain than they had 5 minutes ago. I didn't keep it secret, Mom. I tried to tell you at Carmen's birthday last month, but the conversation kept turning to her new apartment. I tried to bring it up at Easter, but everyone was focused on Carmen's new relationship. I tried to share it at Dad's retirement party, but Carmen announced her bank job that same day and that became the main topic. The truth hung in the air like smoke. I could see them all remembering those conversations, remembering how they'd nodded politely when I started to speak, and then immediately redirected attention back to Carmen's latest drama or triumph. The job I've been just working for 4 years involved writing the grant proposal that brought $12 million in federal funding to expand healthcare access for agricultural communities. While you all thought I was wasting my expensive education, I was designing programs that have been adopted by nonprofits in 8 other states. I pulled out my phone and opened the news app. Last month, the Los Angeles Times ran a feature about innovative healthcare solutions in underserved communities. Would you like to see the article? I handed the phone to Dad, who read the headline aloud in a shaky voice. Local Medical Director Rachel Martinez leads Revolutionary Community Health Initiative. The photo showed me in a white coat, standing next to one of our mobile health units, looking confident and professional. Carmen finally found her voice. Rachel, I had no idea. I thought you were just. You never talk about your work like it's important. I never talk about my work like it's important, because every time I tried, someone in this family made it clear that Carmen's job updates were more interesting. So I stopped trying to compete for attention and started focusing on doing work that mattered. The room was electric now. Everyone was staring, recalculating, trying to process that the family afterthought had become someone they didn't recognize. Cousin Tony, who'd been unemployed for 6 months, whispered, Regional Director. That's a real job. It's not just a job, I said, putting my phone away. It's a calling. Next month, I'm keynoting the National Conference on Rural Healthcare in Denver. The month after that, I'm testifying before the state legislature about funding for community health programs. And in January, I start my new role with a salary that's more than Dad made in his best year at the plant. The number I didn't mention, $135,000 plus benefits and a housing allowance, hung unspoken in the air. I could see them doing mental calculations, comparing it to Carmen's $22 an hour bank job. Carmen's face had gone pale. Rachel, I didn't mean what I said. I was just joking around. You know I don't really think. Yes, you do, I said simply. You meant exactly what you said. And that's okay, because while you were building your social media presence and cycling through entry-level jobs, I was building programs that literally save lives. While you were the family success story, I was becoming someone who actually creates success for other people. Dad stood up abruptly, his hands shaking slightly. Rachel, sweetheart, we had no idea. You should have told us how important your work was. We would have what? Dad, listened, been proud, because I tried to tell you. For 4 years I tried to share what I was working on, what I was building, what I was achieving, but every conversation became about Carmen. Every family gathering became a celebration of whatever small step forward she'd managed to take. I looked around the room again, at faces that were now showing a mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and something that might have been respect. I'm not angry with any of you. I'm not here to punish anyone or make anyone feel bad. I'm here because it's my birthday, and I wanted to share my good news with my family. The gesture of grace hung in the air like an olive branch, but I wasn't done. Carmen, since you're interested in career advancement and financial stability, I actually have an opening for a medical program coordinator at our East LA facility. The starting salary is $58,000, plus full health benefits and educational assistance. The position involves coordinating patient services and community outreach. It's challenging work, but it's meaningful, and it pays more than twice what you're making at the bank. The offer landed like a small bomb in the middle of the room. Carmen's eyes went wide. Mom gasped audibly. Dad sat back down heavily, staring at me like I'd just performed a magic trick. You'd offer me a job. After what I just said, Carmen's voice was small, uncertain. I'd offer you a job because of who I am, not because of what you said. But I won't offer you special treatment, because you're my sister. You'd have to interview like everyone else, and you'd have to earn your place on the team. The work we do is too important to compromise for family politics. Carmen took the business card I extended with trembling fingers. I don't understand. You could have told everyone to shut up. You could have embarrassed me. You could have made me look terrible. Why are you being kind? Because success isn't about making other people smaller, Carmen. It's about building something so solid that when people try to tear you down, they just bounce off. I gathered my purse and jacket, my movements deliberate and calm, but I'm not staying for the rest of the party. I have a conference call with the regional medical coordinator in Phoenix in an hour, and then I'm reviewing budget proposals for our new teen pregnancy prevention program. As I headed toward the front door, the family erupted in voices.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
All talking at once. Dad calling my name, Mom trying to apologize, relatives suddenly remembering that they'd always known I was special, but I kept walking. Rachel, wait. Dad called after me. Stay, please. We want to hear more about your work, about Denver, about everything. We're proud of you. We've always been proud. I turned back one last time, my hand on the doorknob. Dad, I've wanted to tell you about my work for 4 years, but every time I tried, the conversation turned to Carmen's latest crisis, or achievement. I stopped trying to be heard, and started building something worth hearing. I paused, looking at each of them in turn. I love you all, but I'm not going to keep making myself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. If you want to know about my life, you'll have to actually ask about my life, not just remember to include me when it's convenient. The front door closed behind me with a soft click. No slamming, no drama, no theatrical exit, just the quiet sound of someone who'd finally learned the difference between being seen and being truly recognized. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood in golden light. I sat in my car, not the beaten-up Honda I'd driven in college, but the reliable Subaru Outback I'd bought last year, when my promotion to senior program manager came with a substantial raise. My phone was already buzzing with texts, but I didn't check them. Instead, I drove to my apartment in Silver Lake, the tiny place that Carmen had mocked. It was a one-bedroom with hardwood floors, a modern kitchen, and a home office, where I'd written the healthcare access proposal that had caught the attention of the regional board. The walls were covered with certificates, awards, and photos from medical conferences, a professional life my family had never seen, because they'd never asked to see it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and my laptop, preparing for the Phoenix call. This was my real birthday present, not the recognition from my family, not the shocked looks or the sudden respect, but the reminder that I'd built a career and a life that mattered, with or without their applause. The work I was doing was too important to be derailed by family drama. Tomorrow, I'd be back to reviewing proposals for expanded mental health services in agricultural communities. Next week, I'd be in Sacramento meeting with state health officials about funding for our diabetes prevention program. Next month, I'd be standing in front of 300 healthcare professionals in Denver, sharing the programs and policies that were making real differences in real lives. The phone call with Phoenix went well. Dr. Rodriguez, the site director there, was excited about the new diabetes screening initiative and had ideas for expanding our mobile health services into rural areas outside Tucson. We talked for over an hour about implementation timelines, staffing needs, and community partnership. It was the kind of conversation that energized me, the kind of work that made every difficult family gathering worth enduring. After the call, I finally checked my messages. Carmen had texted 4 times, "Rachel, I'm so sorry, I had no idea about your job. Can we talk? I want to learn about what you do." Mom had called twice and left voicemails that I wasn't ready to listen to. Dad had sent a text that just said, "Proud of you, Misha, always have been." But the message that surprised me came from my cousin Sophia. "Rachel, I looked up your organization online. I had no idea you were doing all this. My friend Maria has been trying to find healthcare for her kids since she lost her job. Can I give her your contact info?" That was the message I answered first, because at the end of the day, the work mattered more than the recognition. The families we served mattered more than family politics, and the woman I'd become through years of quiet determination mattered more than the disappointed family dynamics I'd grown up with. 2 days later, Carmen called, not texted, actually called. "Rachel, can we meet for coffee? I've been reading about community health partners online. I want to understand what you do, really understand, not just pretend to be interested." We met that Saturday, at a cafe in Los Feliz neutral territory, away from family expectations and childhood roles. Carmen arrived first, nervous, checking her phone. When I walked in, she looked up and said, "You look different. More, I don't know, more like yourself." "I am more like myself," I replied, sitting across from her. "I'm not trying to fit into anyone's idea of who I should be." For 2 hours we talked honestly for the first time in years, about her struggles with direction and purpose, about my years of building something meaningful while feeling invisible, about the family dynamics that had shaped us both in different ways. She didn't immediately ask about the job I'd offered. She asked about the work itself, about what drew me to healthcare, about what it felt like to see programs I'd designed actually helping people. "I always knew you were smart," she said finally. "I just didn't know you were this accomplished, this important. I guess I was scared that if everyone knew how successful you were, they'd realize how much I was struggling." "Carmen," I said, reaching across the table, "success isn't a competition between us. There's room for both of us to build meaningful lives, but you can't build yours by tearing down mine." By the time we left the cafe, something fundamental had shifted between us, not back to how things were, that would never work, but forward to something new and more honest. She did apply for the coordinator position, not because she was my sister, but because she'd finally realized she wanted to do work that mattered. 3 weeks later, I stood in the conference room at our downtown headquarters, leading a presentation to the state health department about expanding rural healthcare access. Around the table sat doctors, policy experts, and government officials who'd flown in from Sacramento, specifically to hear our proposal. My voice was steady and confident as I walked them through the data, the implementation timeline, and the projected outcomes. After the meeting, Dr. Patricia Chen, the state's Director of Rural Health Initiatives, shook my hand and said, "Miss Martinez, this is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. How soon can you start the pilot program?" That afternoon, I called my parents from my office, not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted to share good news with people who loved me. "The state approved our rural health expansion," I told them, We're getting $3.8 million in funding to bring medical services to agricultural communities across Central California. Dad's voice was thick with emotion. Rachel, that's incredible. You're helping so many people. We're so proud of you. I know you are, Dad. I've always known that. I just needed you to show it. The following month, I did keynote the National Conference on Rural Healthcare in Denver. My presentation was titled, Breaking Barriers: How Community-Based Programs Transform Healthcare Access. In the audience of 400 healthcare professionals, I spotted two familiar faces, Mom and Carmen, who'd flown out to surprise me. After my talk, they found me in the hotel lobby. Carmen hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm proud to be your sister, and I'm proud to work for Community Health Partners." She'd gotten the coordinator job on her own merit, after a rigorous interview process and a probationary period that proved she was serious about the work. In her first month, she'd already implemented a patient follow-up system that increased treatment compliance by 30%. Mom squeezed my hands and said, "Rachel, I owe you an apology, not just for the birthday party, but for all the years I was so focused on helping Carmen find her way, that I forgot to celebrate you finding yours." "You don't need to apologize for loving her, Mom. You just need to remember that I needed to be seen too." We stood in that hotel lobby, three women from East LA, who'd learned that love doesn't require anyone to be smaller, and success doesn't require anyone else to fail. It just requires the courage to build something meaningful and the patience to wait for the right people to notice. The next week, the Los Angeles Times ran a follow-up story. Local healthcare director Rachel Martinez secures millions in rural health funding. The article included a photo of me at the podium in Denver, confident and clear-eyed, with a quote that became my professional motto: "Real change happens quietly, one patient and one program at a time, but when you're committed to the work, the impact speaks for itself." Carmen framed that article and hung it in her cubicle at our East LA facility, where she now coordinated services for over 800 families. Not because she was my sister, but because she'd finally learned what I'd known all along, that you can't build a meaningful career on potential and family connections alone. That Christmas was different. We gathered at Mom and Dad's house, but this time the conversation included genuine questions about my work in Denver, my upcoming promotion to Southwest Regional Director, and the new teen health program I was launching in partnership with local schools. Carmen talked about her patients, her plans for nursing school, and the sense of purpose she'd found in healthcare work. I sat at the dinner table, no longer invisible, no longer the family disappointment. I was Rachel Martinez, the daughter who'd turned quiet determination into meaningful impact, who'd built a career that saved lives, who'd learned that sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to stop arguing about it, and start demonstrating it every single day. And when Dad raised his glass to toast the family, he looked directly at me and said, "To Rachel, who taught us that success isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, it's about doing work that matters, whether anyone's watching or not." I smiled, raising my glass in return, because that birthday party confrontation had been just the beginning. The real story was what came after, the choice to keep building, keep growing, keep proving that sometimes the family disappointment is really the family's greatest success story, waiting patiently for the right moment to be told. The tension in that cramped living room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Carmen sat frozen on the sectional sofa, her plastic fork still hovering halfway to her mouth, loaded with tres leches cake that she'd forgotten she was eating. The fairy lights Dad had strung up months ago cast dancing shadows across faces that had gone from celebratory to stunned in the span of 30 seconds. Aunt Rosa's hand had stopped mid-gesture, her finger pointed at nothing, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. Uncle Miguel's beer bottle remained tilted at an impossible angle, foam gathering at the rim while he stared at me, like I'd just announced I was moving to Mars. The business card I'd handed Carmen trembled between her fingers. Community Health Partners, it read in clean blue lettering, with my name underneath, Rachel Martinez, Regional Medical Director. The same organization she'd dismissed as that little clinic was now revealed to be something she couldn't quite process. I watched her eyes scan the card over and over,
like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense with her worldview. Dad leaned forward from his recliner, his weathered hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He'd worked 32 years at the Chrysler plant in downtown LA, coming home every night with grease under his fingernails, and stories about quotas and quality control. The idea that his quiet daughter was now responsible for a budget larger than his entire plant's annual revenue was something his mind couldn't quite grasp. Rachel, Mija, he said slowly, when you say $14 million, you mean you're in charge of that much money? I nodded calmly, watching him try to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the professional he was just discovering. The regional budget covers medical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, staffing costs, facility maintenance, and program development across 4 states. Last quarter alone, we provided over 47,000 patient visits, including emergency care, prenatal services, and chronic disease management. The numbers hung in the air like foreign language to most of them. Cousin Tony, who'd been bragging about Carmen's part-time bank job just minutes earlier, shifted uncomfortably on the folding chair he'd brought from the kitchen. His own unemployment had stretched to 8 months now, and the contrast between his situation and what I'd just revealed made the room feel smaller somehow. Mom stood by the kitchen doorway, her apron still tied around her waist from preparing the meal, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before: confusion, pride, embarrassment, and something that might have been grief for all the conversations we'd never had. "But Rachel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you never told us any of this. 4 years you've been doing this work, and we had no idea." The accusation in her tone was gentle but unmistakable. How could I have kept such a significant part of my life hidden from them? But the question revealed the fundamental understanding that had been building between us for years. I hadn't hidden anything. I'd tried repeatedly to share my work, my achievements, my challenges, and my growth, but every attempt had been redirected, overshadowed, or simply ignored in favor of whatever drama or milestone Carmen was experiencing. "I tried to tell you, Mom," I said, keeping my voice steady and factual. "At Carmen's birthday in March, I started to mention the federal grant proposal I was working on, but the conversation immediately shifted to Carmen's new apartment and whether Dad should co-sign the lease. At Easter, I brought up the mobile health unit program we were launching, but Carmen announced she was dating someone new, and that became the focus of the entire meal. At Dad's retirement party, I actually brought printed materials about our work, thinking maybe people would want to see what I'd been doing, but Carmen chose that same day to announce her bank job, and my folder ended up forgotten on the gift table. The specificity of my examples created an uncomfortable recognition in the room. I could see them remembering those conversations, those moments when they'd politely nodded at my attempts to share and then immediately pivoted to more interesting topics. The pattern had been so consistent, so unconscious, that none of them had realized they were doing it. Carmen finally set down her fork, the tres leches cake forgotten. "Rachel, I didn't know. I mean, I knew you worked in healthcare, but She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, because finishing it would require admitting what she'd actually thought about my work and my life. "You thought I was a secretary or a receptionist at a small clinic," I finished for her. "You thought my graduate degree in public health administration was just an expensive piece of paper that I'd never use for anything meaningful. You thought my long hours and weekend work were signs that I couldn't manage my time properly, not that I was building programs from the ground up." The truth was stark and undeniable. Carmen's face flushed red, and she looked down at her hands.
You never seemed excited about your job. You never talked about it like it was important."
I never talked about it like it was important, because every time I tried, someone made it clear that my work updates were less interesting than your relationship drama or job changes. So I stopped competing for airtime and started focusing on the work itself. Uncle Miguel finally remembered. He was holding his beer and took a long swig, using the action to buy time while he processed what he'd heard. As the oldest of Dad's brothers, he'd always positioned himself as the family sage, the one who handed out advice and judgments about everyone's life choices. He'd spent years subtly criticizing my seriousness, my lack of boyfriend drama, my tendency to leave family gatherings. Now he was recalculating every interaction we'd ever had. Regional director, he repeated slowly, like he was testing how the words felt in his mouth. That's management. Real management. It's executive leadership. I corrected gently. I report directly to the chief medical officer and the board of directors.
I oversee department heads, approve hiring decisions, and represent the organization at state and federal meetings. Next month, I'll be testifying before a congressional subcommittee about healthcare access in underserved communities. The word congressional landed like a small bomb in the middle of the room. Aunt Rosa actually gasped. Cousin Sophia looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. Even the kids playing in the backyard seemed to sense the shift in energy and quieted their voices. Dad's eyes filled with tears. He was trying hard not to let fall. Rachel, why didn't you tell me about Congress? That's incredible. My daughter talking to Congress. The pain in his voice was real and deep. This was a man who'd raised 2 daughters on a factory worker's salary, who'd sacrificed and saved to help us both get college educations, who'd dreamed of seeing his children succeed beyond anything he'd been able to achieve. To discover that one of those daughters had already surpassed his wildest dreams, and he'd been completely unaware of it, was a wound that went straight to his heart. I tried to tell you about the congressional testimony, Dad, 2 weeks ago, when I called to confirm I was coming to the party today. But Carmen was there, and she was upset about something that happened at work, and the entire conversation became about helping her process her feelings about her supervisor. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every family interaction for years had followed the same script. Carmen's needs, Carmen's feelings, Carmen's crises, Carmen's small victories treated as major achievement. My steady progress, my growing responsibilities, my increasing impact, had been background noise in the symphony of Carmen's emotional requirements. Carmen's eyes filled with tears now, but they weren't tears of hurt or anger. They were tears of recognition and shame. Oh my God, Rachel, I've been so selfish. I've made everything about me for years, haven't I? The question hung in the air, begging for reassurance that wasn't completely true. I could have softened it. Could have made her feel better about the years of unconscious self-centeredness, but this moment was too important for comfortable lies. Not selfish, exactly, I said carefully. But you've needed a lot of support, and the family has given it to you, which is fine. That's what families do. But support became so focused on your needs that there wasn't much attention left for anyone else's achievements. Mom sank into the kitchen chair she kept by the window, the one where she drank her morning coffee and watched the neighborhood kids walk to school. Rachel, I feel terrible. I've been such a bad mother. I was so worried about Carmen, about helping her find her way, that I completely took you for granted. You weren't a bad mother, Mom. You were a mother dealing with 2 very different daughters who needed very different things. Carmen needed encouragement and guidance to find her direction. I needed recognition and respect for the direction I'd already found. But somehow, all the family energy went toward helping Carmen discover herself, and none of it went toward celebrating what I'd already accomplished. The distinction was important, and I could see it landing with clarity around the room. This wasn't about favoritism or deliberate neglect. It was about unconscious family dynamics that had developed over years, but the squeaky wheel getting the grease while the wheel that was already running smoothly got ignored. Cousin Tony finally found his voice. Rachel, I owe you an apology. I've made jokes about you being too serious, too career-focused. I said you needed to lighten up, enjoy life more, but you were building something incredible while you were dealing with your own challenges. I said diplomatically, everyone's path looks different. I'm not judging anyone for their journey, I'm just asking to be seen for mine. But even as I spoke the words, I knew the impact of years of being overlooked had been profound. I'd learned to validate my own achievements because no one else was paying attention. I'd learned to celebrate my successes quietly because there was no audience for them. I'd learned to process my challenges alone because family emotional bandwidth was always directed elsewhere. The strength I'd developed from being underestimated was real and valuable, but the cost had been real too. Years of feeling invisible in my own family, years of wondering if my accomplishments mattered to anyone but me, years of showing up to family events, knowing that my professional life would be treated as background information while Carmen's personal life took center stage. Carmen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The job you offered me, the coordinator position, you really think I could do it? I think you could do it if you're serious about the work, but it's not like the bank, Carmen. The people we serve are dealing with serious health crises, language barriers, financial stress, and often trauma from their immigration experiences. You can't just show up and do the minimum. The work requires emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and genuine commitment to serving people who have fewer advantages than we've had. The requirements I outlined were both a challenge and a task. Was Carmen ready to step into work that was bigger than herself, that required real growth and dedication? Or was she looking for another job that would provide stability without requiring transformation? I want to try, she said quietly. I want to do work that matters. I'm tired of just existing, tired of jobs that don't mean anything, tired of drama that doesn't lead anywhere. I want to build something, like you have. The sincerity in her voice was something I hadn't heard in years. This wasn't Carmen looking for an easy solution or family connections to solve her problem. This was Carmen recognizing that she needed to fundamentally change her approach to work and life. Then apply, I said simply. Go through the interview process like everyone else. Prove that you're ready for the responsibility. And if you get the job, be prepared to work harder than you've ever worked before. Dad stood up abruptly, his emotion finally overwhelming his ability to sit still. I need to call my brother Luis. I need to tell him about my daughter, the regional director. I need to call everyone and tell them what you've accomplished. The impulse was touching but also revealing. Now that my achievements were undeniable, he wanted to share them with pride. But where had that pride been during the years when my accomplishments were smaller, when I was building toward this moment, one grant proposal and one program at a time? Dad, you don't need to call anyone. This isn't about other people knowing. This is about our family understanding who I am and what I do. But I could see in his eyes that he needed to share this news, needed to reclaim some of the pride he felt he'd missed out on. For years, when relatives asked about his daughters, he'd talked about Carmen's potential and my stability. Now he was realizing he'd been sitting on a story that would have made him the proudest father in East LA. The afternoon light was starting to fade through the living room windows, casting longer shadows across the scene. The birthday party that had started as Carmen's usual show had transformed into something none of us had expected. The tres leches cake sat mostly uneaten on the coffee table. The presents I'd brought remained unopened on the gift table. But something more important than cake or gifts was happening in that room. A family was recalibrating. People who had unconsciously developed patterns of attention and neglect were suddenly seeing those patterns clearly. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the invisible daughter in the corner. I was the center of attention for reasons that actually reflected who I'd become, not who they needed me to be. Carmen picked up the business card again, studying it like it contained secret. Community Health Partners. I'm going to research everything about this organization. I want to understand what you've built. Good, I said. Understanding the mission and the work is the first step toward being effective in any role that. Mom stood up and walked over to me, her movements tentative like she was approaching someone she didn't quite recognize. Rachel, can I hug you? I know I don't deserve it after today, after all the ways I've failed to see you, but I'm so proud of you, Mija, so incredibly proud. I let her wrap her arms around me, feeling the complicated emotions of a daughter who'd never doubted her mother's love, but had sometimes questioned her mother's attention. I love you too, Mom. We just need to do better at seeing each other clearly. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears. Tomorrow I want you to tell me everything, about your work, about Denver, about Congress. I want to understand what my daughter has been doing while I wasn't paying attention. The offer was generous and genuine, but it also came with the weight of years that couldn't be reclaimed. Tomorrow's conversation would be wonderful, but it couldn't replace the dozens of conversations we should have had over the past 4 years. Still, it was a beginning. Uncle Miguel raised his beer bottle in an impromptu toast. To Rachel, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect for the first time in my memory. To my niece, who's been changing the world while we weren't looking. The toast was sweet, but it also highlighted the central irony of the moment. I hadn't been hiding my world-changing work. I'd been doing it in plain sight, sharing it when I could, building it steadily and openly. The family just hadn't been looking in my direction. As the afternoon wound down and relatives began to make their excuses to leave, I found myself standing in the kitchen with Carmen while Mom packed up leftover cake. The party was ending, but the real conversation was just beginning. "Rachel," Carmen said quietly, "I need you to know something. I've been jealous of you for years, not of your job, because I didn't understand your job, but of your certainty, your direction, the way you always seemed to know exactly what you were doing while I was flailing around trying to figure out who I was supposed to be." The admission was unexpected and vulnerable. I didn't always know what I was doing, Carmen. I just knew what mattered to me, and I kept moving toward it even when it was hard. "How did you figure that out? How did you know that healthcare was your calling?" It was the first time Carmen had ever asked me a serious question about my professional life, and I found myself wanting to give her a real answer. "I started volunteering at a free clinic during college. I saw how many people were falling through the cracks of the healthcare system, how many families were choosing between medicine and food, between doctor visits and rent. I realized I could either feel bad about it, or do something about it. And you chose to do something about it." I chose to learn everything I could about healthcare systems, policy development, and program management. I chose to work for organizations that were actually solving problems instead of just talking about them. I chose to build a career around service instead of just personal advancement. Carmen nodded slowly, processing this insight into my thinking. "I want that. I want to build a career around something that matters." "Then do it, but understand that it means making choices that other people might not understand. It means working late, when your friends are going out. It means studying policy documents instead of watching Netflix. It means caring more about impact than recognition." The conversation felt different from any we'd had in years. Carmen was asking real questions and listening to real answers. For the first time I could see her not as my dramatic younger sister, but as an adult woman genuinely trying to figure out how to build a meaningful life. By the time I left that evening, the family dynamic had shifted in ways that felt both subtle and seismic. I was no longer the overlooked daughter whose achievements were background noise, but more importantly, I was no longer willing to accept that role even if they tried to give it back to me. The drive home to Silver Lake gave me time to process what had happened. The birthday party that had started with Carmen's casual cruelty had ended with the kind of family recognition I'd wanted for years, but the victory felt complicated. Part of me was satisfied that they finally understood what I'd been building. Part of me was sad that it had taken such a dramatic revelation for them to pay attention, and part of me was already planning how to maintain these new dynamics going forward. My phone buzzed with texts throughout the evening, Carmen sending me links to articles about community health partners, Dad forwarding my name and accomplishments to relatives across the city, Mom leaving voicemails about how proud she was and how sorry she felt for missing so much. But the message that meant the most came from my supervisor, Dr. Trisha Valdez, who'd texted about the congressional testimony prep materials being ready for review, because at the end of the day, the family recognition was gratifying, but the work itself remained the most important thing. The programs I'd built, the lives we'd improved, the systems we'd changed, that was the legacy that mattered most. That night, I sat in my home office reviewing testimony notes, and feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with family drama and everything to do with professional purpose. Tomorrow, I'd be back to the work that had shaped me, the mission that drove me, and the impact that justified every long hour and late night I'd invested. The family had finally seen me clearly, but more importantly, I'd never lost sight of who I was and what I was building, regardless of whether anyone was watching. That clarity, that sense of purpose, that commitment to meaningful work, those were the real gifts that had emerged from years of being underestimated. And those gifts would serve me long after the birthday party drama faded into family history. Word traveled fast in our neighborhood. By the time I arrived at work Monday morning,
My phone had been buzzing since dawn with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. Cousin Elena from Pasadena had somehow gotten my number and left a rambling voicemail about how she'd always known I was destined for greatness. Tia Mercedes called 3 times asking if it was true that I was some kind of doctor now, and whether I could help her grandson get a job. Even my high school friend Maria, who I'd lost touch with years ago, had tracked me down through social media to congratulate me on making it big. The attention felt surreal and uncomfortable. These were people who'd ignored my career updates at family gatherings, who'd never asked about my work beyond polite small talk, who'd treated my professional life as background noise to more interesting family drama. Now suddenly, everyone wanted to claim a piece of my success, to retroactively position themselves as supporters who'd always believed in me. But the call that surprised me most came from Dr. Elena Resterbo, the chief medical officer at Community Health Partners. She rarely contacted regional directors directly unless there was a crisis or a major policy change. When her name appeared on my caller ID at 8:30 Monday morning, my first thought was that something had gone wrong with one of our programs. "Rachel," she said without preamble, "I've been getting calls all weekend from board members, state health officials, and reporters asking about our regional medical director who's testifying before Congress next month. Apparently, word is spreading in certain circles about your upcoming appearance, and people are taking notice of our organization in ways they haven't before." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Dr. Resterbo, I hope I haven't created any problem." I mentioned the congressional testimony to my family, and I think word may have spread beyond problems. She interrupted, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Rachel, this is the opposite of problem. The state health department called this morning, asking if we'd be interested in piloting an expanded rural health initiative based on your testimony recommendations. The California Nonprofit Association wants to feature us in their quarterly magazine, and 3 major donors who've never heard of us before are requesting meetings about potential partnerships." The irony wasn't lost on me. My family's sudden interest in my career was creating ripple effects in my professional world that I hadn't anticipated. The network of relatives and community connections that had ignored my work for years was now inadvertently becoming a publicity machine for Community Health Partners. "There's something else," Dr. Resterbo continued. "The board wants to accelerate your promotion timeline. We were planning to announce your elevation to Southwest Regional Director in January, but given the attention we're receiving and the congressional testimony, they want to make it official next month. Are you ready for that level of responsibility?" Southwest Regional Director. The position would put me in charge of healthcare programs across California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, a staff of over 200 medical professionals, an annual budget approaching $25 million, the opportunity to influence healthcare policy at the federal level. "I'm ready," I said without hesitation, because I was. The work I'd been doing for 4 years had been preparing me for exactly this kind of responsibility. "Good. We'll make the announcement at the board meeting Friday, and Rachel, your family connections might be inadvertently helpful, but your qualifications speak for themselves. This promotion is based on merit, not publicity." After ending the call, I sat in my office overlooking downtown Los Angeles, trying to process how quickly everything was changing. The birthday party confrontation that had felt so personal and small was somehow creating professional opportunities I hadn't expected, but the attention also felt precarious, like it was based more on novelty than substance. My assistant Jennifer knocked on my door with a concerned expression. "Rachel, there's a reporter from the LA Weekly in the lobby asking to speak with you. She says it's about a human interest story on local nonprofit leaders. Should I tell her you're unavailable?" The media attention was starting already. I could feel the careful professional life I'd built becoming public property, subject to scrutiny and interpretation by people who didn't understand the work or the mission. "Set up a meeting for later this week," I said, "but make it clear that any interview will focus on Community Health Partners programs, not my personal story." The rest of Monday passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and meetings, but underneath the normal work rhythm was an undercurrent of anxiety about the attention I was receiving. By Tuesday, the anxiety had crystallized into something more specific. My family's newfound interest in my career was becoming a liability. Carmen called that afternoon, her voice bright with excitement. "Rachel, I've been telling everyone about your job. My friend Ashley's mom works for Channel 7 News, and she wants to do a feature story about you. Isn't that amazing? My heart sank. Carmen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I need you to stop promoting my work to random people. I'm not looking for media attention, and my organization has specific protocols for public relations, but this could be huge for you. Think about how proud Dad would be to see you on TV. The conversation revealed the fundamental disconnect between Carmen's understanding of my career and the reality of my position. She was treating my professional achievements like personal accomplishments to be celebrated and shared, not recognizing that my work involved sensitive populations, confidential programs, and institutional responsibilities that couldn't be turned into feel-good news stories. Carmen, the people we serve include undocumented immigrants, domestic violence survivors, and families dealing with serious mental health crises. Media attention could actually harm our ability to provide services if it makes our clients feel unsafe or exposed. The silence on the other end of the line told me this hadn't occurred to her. In her excitement about finally having a successful sister to brag about, she'd forgotten that my success was built on serving vulnerable populations who needed discretion, not publicity. Oh, she said quietly, I didn't think about that. I just wanted people to know how amazing you are. I understand the impulse, but I need you to let me manage my own professional reputation. If there are going to be interviews or articles, they need to go through proper channels and focus on our programs, not on me personally. By Wednesday, the situation had escalated beyond family enthusiasm. My phone was ringing constantly with calls from relatives, family friends, and acquaintances who'd heard some version of my story and wanted to connect, congratulate, or ask for favor. The narrative had grown in the telling, transforming from Rachel got promoted, to Rachel is running hospitals across the country, to Rachel is advising the president on healthcare. The distortions were harmless but frustrating. Each phone call required time I didn't have to correct misconceptions and manage expectations. More concerning was the number of people who were suddenly treating me like a personal ATM or job placement service, assuming that my professional success meant I could solve their financial or employment problem. Thursday brought a crisis that crystallized all my concerns about unwanted attention. Jennifer buzzed my office with urgency in her voice. Rachel, there's a man in the lobby who says he's your cousin. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's refusing to leave and saying he needs to speak with you about a family emergency. I didn't recognize the name she gave me, but family trees in large Mexican-American families could be complicated. I agreed to see him for 5 minutes, expecting some distant relative with a genuine crisis. Instead, I found myself facing a man in his 30s who I vaguely remembered from childhood gatherings, someone who'd never spoken to me directly, but who apparently felt entitled to my professional assistance, now that my success had become family news. Rachel, prima, it's so good to see you, he said with false familiarity. I heard about your big job, and I knew you'd want to help family. My kid needs surgery, and the insurance is giving us problems. I figured you could make some calls, pull some strings, get us taken care of. The assumption that my position gave me the power to manipulate insurance companies or provide special treatment was both naive and troubling. More concerning was his casual expectation that I owed him assistance, based on a family connection we'd never actually had. I'm sorry about your child's situation, I said carefully, but I don't have any influence over insurance companies. What I can do is give you the contact information for our patient advocacy department, which helps families navigate insurance issues and find alternative resources. His face darkened. Come on, Rachel, you're running this whole organization. You can't tell me you don't have connections, people who owe you favors. This is family we're talking about. The entitlement was staggering. This was someone who'd never shown interest in my life or work until it might benefit him, now demanding that I compromise my professional ethics to solve his personal problem. I could see how quickly my family's pride in my success could become a burden if relatives started viewing me as a resource to be exploited, rather than a person to be respected. I understand you're frustrated, I said firmly, but I can't and won't use my position inappropriately. What I can offer is legitimate help through proper channels. If that's not sufficient, I suggest you contact your insurance company's appeals department directly. He left angry, muttering about family loyalty and forgetting where you came from. The encounter left me shaken, not because of his demands, but because it revealed how my newfound family recognition could attract exactly the kind of attention I'd spent years trying to avoid. That evening, I called Carmen with a request that felt both necessary and sad. I need you to stop sharing details about my work with people. The attention is becoming problematic, and I'm getting requests and demands that put me in uncomfortable positions. Rachel, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I was just so excited that people finally knew how successful you are. I appreciate that you're proud of me, but success in my field requires discretion and professional boundaries. I can't have relatives showing up at my office expecting special treatment, or reporters calling because someone heard an exaggerated version of my story. The conversation was difficult because I could hear the hurt in Carmen's voice. She'd finally found something about me to celebrate publicly, and now I was asking her to stop celebrating. But the alternative was allowing my personal life to interfere with my professional responsibilities, which wasn't acceptable. Friday's board meeting brought the official announcement of my promotion to Southwest Regional Director, effective immediately. The board members congratulated me warmly, emphasizing that the decision was based on my track record of program development, budget management, and policy innovation. Dr. Restro presented me with a new business card and a key to the executive conference room, Southwest Regional Director. The title felt both earned and surreal. 4 years ago, I'd been a recent graduate hoping to make a small difference in community health. Now I was responsible for healthcare programs across 5 states, with the authority to shape policy at the federal level. But even as I accepted congratulations and shook hands with board members, part of my mind was calculating how to manage the family attention that would inevitably follow this announcement. The promotion would mean more visibility, more responsibility, and potentially more relatives appearing in my lobby with demands and expectations. During the lunch break, Dr. Restro pulled me aside. Rachel, I hope you know that this promotion reflects the board's complete confidence in your abilities. Your work on the Rural Health Initiative alone would justify this advancement, but your overall track record is exceptional. Thank you, Dr. Restro. I'm honored by the board's trust, and I'm committed to expanding our impact across the region. Good. Now, I want to address something that might be delicate. I've heard that your recent family situation has created some unexpected attention for our organization. While that's not necessarily problematic, I want to make sure you're prepared for the increased scrutiny that comes with this level of leadership. The conversation was professional but pointed. She was tactfully acknowledging that my personal life had become intertwined with our institutional reputation in ways that required careful management. I understand the responsibility that comes with representing community health partners at this level. I assured her I'm committed to maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct and protecting our organization's reputation. I know you are, but I also want you to know that if family pressures or outside attention ever interfere with your work, we can provide support in managing those challenges. The offer was generous and necessary. Leading a regional healthcare organization while managing family expectations and media interest would require careful balance and probably professional support. That afternoon, I returned to my office to find 3 voicemail messages from reporters, 2 emails from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, and a handwritten note from my building's security guard, letting me know that someone claiming to be my uncle had tried to get access to my floor without authorization. The situation was escalating beyond what I could manage through family conversations alone. I needed to establish clear boundaries and professional protocols for handling the attention my promotion would inevitably generate. I spent the rest of Friday developing a media strategy with our communications department and setting up systems to screen calls and visitors more carefully. The excitement of my promotion was being tempered by the reality that success at this level came with complications I hadn't fully anticipated. But as I sat in my office that evening, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the programs I'd now be expanding across 5 states, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with family recognition or media attention. the work itself remained the most important thing. The thousands of families who would receive better healthcare because of our programs, the policy changes that would improve access for underserved communities, the medical professionals I'd be training and supporting across the Southwest.
My family's newfound pride in my success was gratifying, but it was also revealing the difference between being celebrated and being understood. The relatives calling to congratulate me still didn't really grasp what I did or why it mattered. They were excited about my title and salary, but they weren't asking about our patient outcomes or program innovations. The reporter interviews and media attention would focus on the feel-good story of a local girl making good, but they'd miss the complex policy work and systems change that made our programs effective. Even the family members who were genuinely proud of me were proud of their idea of my success, not necessarily the reality of my work. But that was okay. I'd learned years ago that external validation, while nice, couldn't be the primary motivation for meaningful work. The families we served, the communities we supported, the health outcomes we improved, those were the measures that mattered most. Monday would bring new challenges as Southwest Regional Director. Expanded responsibilities, larger budgets, more complex political dynamic, but it would also bring expanded opportunities to create change at a scale I'd only dreamed about 4 years ago. The birthday party confrontation had revealed my family's capacity for recognizing achievement when it became undeniable. But more importantly, it had reminded me that I'd built something meaningful with or without their attention, and I could continue building regardless of whether anyone was watching. The promotion was just the next step in work that had always been bigger than personal recognition, and as the city settled into evening quiet around me, I felt ready for whatever came next, knowing that my purpose was clear and my commitment was unshakable, regardless of how many relatives called or reporters knocked on my door. 3 months after my promotion to Southwest Regional Director, I stood in the marble-columned hallway of the Rayburn House office building in Washington, D.C., adjusting my navy blazer and reviewing my testimony notes one final time. The congressional hearing on healthcare access in underserved communities was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and I was the lead witness representing nonprofit healthcare organizations across the country. My testimony would influence federal funding decisions that could impact millions of families. The irony wasn't lost on me that 6 months ago my own family hadn't understood what I did for work, and now I was about to address members of Congress about the very programs they'd dismissed as insignificant. But the path from that birthday party confrontation to this moment had been more complex and challenging than I'd ever anticipated. The media attention following my promotion had eventually died down, but not before creating lasting changes in my family dynamic. Some of those changes had been positive. Dad had started asking detailed questions about my work, genuinely engaging with the challenges and successes of healthcare policy. Mom had begun introducing me to her friends as my daughter, the regional director, with obvious pride in her voice. Carmen had completed her interview process and been hired as a patient advocate coordinator, throwing herself into the work with dedication that surprised everyone, including herself. But other changes had been more difficult to navigate. Extended family members continued to view me as a resource rather than a person, calling with requests for job recommendations, medical advice, and financial assistance that I couldn't and wouldn't provide. The line between being proud of family success and exploiting family connections had proven difficult for some relatives to understand. The most challenging relationship to rebuild had been with Carmen herself. Her genuine transformation at Community Health Partners had been remarkable. She'd discovered a talent for connecting with patients from similar backgrounds, helping Spanish-speaking families navigate complex medical systems and insurance bureaucracy. Her bilingual skills and cultural competency had made her invaluable to our East LA facility, and she'd already been promoted once based on her performance. But success had also created new tensions between us. Carmen's enthusiasm for the work sometimes led her to overstep boundaries, trying to involve me in cases that weren't my responsibility or seeking special treatment for patients she felt particularly connected to. Learning to separate our professional relationship from our family relationship had required numerous difficult conversations and clear boundary setting that sometimes felt cold, but was necessary for both our career. The morning of the congressional hearing, I'd received a text from Carmen that perfectly captured the complexity of our evolved relationship. Kick ass today, Hermana. Make them understand what we do here. P.S. Miss Rodriguez in room 3 asked me to tell the government lady, thank you for the diabetes program. I told her you're not the government lady. You're my sister, who became the government lady. The message had made me smile, because it reflected both Carmen's growth and her continued tendency to see my work through the lens of family pride rather than institutional responsibility. But it also reminded me why the congressional testimony mattered. Ms. Rodriguez and thousands of patients like her were the reason I'd spent years building programs, writing grants, and developing policies that actually improved lives, rather than just advancing careers. As I walked into the hearing room, I spotted familiar faces in the gallery. Dr. Afu had flown in to observe, along with several board members and policy advocates I'd worked with over the years. But in the back row, I also saw 3 unexpected faces: Mom, Dad, and Carmen, who had apparently coordinated this surprise without telling me. The sight of them sitting together in that formal setting, clearly out of their element, but determined to witness this moment, created a surge of emotion I hadn't expected. Dad was wearing the same suit he'd worn to my college graduation, slightly tight now, but carefully pressed. Mom had on her best dress and was clutching a small notepad, apparently planning to take notes. Carmen wore her professional attire from work, looking nervous but proud. Their presence represented something I'd wanted for years without realizing it: family members who understood enough about my work to appreciate its significance, who cared enough to witness important moments, who had moved beyond treating my career as background noise to recognizing it as something worth celebrating properly. When I was called to testify, I approached the witness table with confidence built from years of preparation for exactly this moment. The committee chair, Representative Patricia Williams from California, introduced me with credentials that would have seemed impossible to my family just months ago. Southwest Regional Director, oversight of $25 million in federal healthcare funding, architect of programs serving over 300,000 patients annually. My testimony focused on the gap between federal healthcare policy and the reality of serving undocumented immigrants, migrant workers, and families living below the poverty line. I presented data on program effectiveness, cost savings from preventive care, and recommendations for policy changes that could expand access while reducing long-term healthcare costs. But midway through my presentation, I found myself departing from my prepared remarks to share a story that felt suddenly relevant. Committee members, when I started this work 4 years ago, my own family didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. They saw me working long hours for modest pay at an organization they'd never heard of, and they assumed I was spinning my wheels in an unimportant job. It took years of building programs and demonstrating results before they recognized the value of this work. I looked up at the gallery, making brief eye contact with my parents. I share this because it illustrates a broader challenge we face in healthcare policy. Communities don't always understand the value of preventive care, policy development, and systems change until they see dramatic results. But by then, we've often lost years that could have been spent building more effective programs. The committee members leaned forward, engaged by the personal connection to policy implications. Representative Williams nodded and said, "Martinez, how do we bridge that gap between community understanding and program development?" "We make the work visible and accessible," I replied. "We involve community members in program design. We measure outcomes that matter to families, not just to funders. And we communicate about our work in ways that help people understand the connection between policy decisions and their daily lives." The rest of my testimony proceeded smoothly, with questions that demonstrated genuine engagement from committee members and policy recommendations that felt both ambitious and achievable. When I concluded, Representative Williams thanked me for bringing both professional expertise and personal insight to this critical discussion. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the witness table, I felt a deep sense of completion that went beyond professional accomplishment. This testimony represented the culmination of years of work that had begun with a simple desire to help families access health care, and had evolved into influencing federal policy at the highest level. During the break, my family approached with expressions I'd never seen before, awe mixed with genuine understanding of what they'd just witnessed. Dad's eyes were bright with tears he was trying not to shed. Mija, I had no idea, watching you up there, talking to Congress like you belonged there. I finally understand what you've been building all these years. Mom squeezed my hand and whispered, I'm so sorry it took me this long to really see you, but I see you now, and I'm so proud I can barely speak. Carmen's reaction was characteristically direct. Holy shit, Rachel, you just told Congress how to fix healthcare, and they listened to you like you were the smartest person in the room. Language, Carmen, Mom scolded automatically, but she was smiling. No, Mom, let her swear. This deserves swearing, Dad said, pulling me into a hug that felt different from any we'd shared before. This wasn't the proud but confused embrace of a father who didn't quite understand his daughter's achievement. This was the recognition hug of a parent who had finally grasped the scope and importance of work he'd been watching from a distance for years. The afternoon reception following the hearing provided an opportunity for networking and informal conversations with committee staff, policy advocates, and other healthcare leaders. But throughout the professional socializing, I found myself watching my family navigate this world with curiosity and genuine engagement. Carmen spent 20 minutes talking with a policy advocate from Texas about cross-border healthcare challenges, asking questions that demonstrated she'd been paying attention during her months at Community Health Partners. Mom struck up a conversation with Dr. Restropro about what it was like to work with me professionally, clearly fishing for reassurance that I was valued and respected by my colleagues. Dad found himself talking with a congressional aide about manufacturing job losses and their impact on healthcare access, drawing connections between his plant experience and the policy discussions he'd heard all day. Watching them engage seriously with my professional world felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had been years in the making. They weren't just proud of my success, they were beginning to understand the substance behind the success, the daily work that created the outcomes, the policy implications that made the work matter beyond individual patient interaction. Late that afternoon, as we shared dinner at a restaurant near Capitol Hill, the conversation flowed in ways that hadn't been possible before my birthday party revelation. Dad asked detailed questions about the congressional budget process and how federal funding decisions affected local programs. Mom wanted to know about the other organizations I collaborated with and whether the work was emotionally difficult. Carmen shared stories from her patient advocacy work that demonstrated genuine professional growth and commitment to the mission. But the moment that crystallized the change in our relationship came when Dad raised his glass and said, "To my daughter Rachel, who taught me that the most important work often happens quietly, behind the scenes, building something solid that lasts, and to Carmen, who's learning that it's never too late to find work that matters." The toast acknowledged both our individual achievements and our different paths to meaningful work. It recognized that success could look different for different people, while still being worthy of equal respect and support. 6 months later, I stood in my new office in the federal building in downtown Los Angeles, having been appointed as the new Deputy Director of Rural Health Initiatives for the Department of Health and Human Services. The position would allow me to implement many of the policy recommendations I'd made during my congressional testimony, working directly with federal agencies to expand healthcare access across underserved communities nationwide. The appointment had generated media attention that my family now knew how to handle appropriately. Carmen had become skilled at directing reporters to official channels rather than offering unauthorized family commentary. Mom and Dad had learned to be proud without being intrusive, supporting my career without trying to manage it. But the real measure of our changed relationship was visible in smaller daily interaction. Dad regularly forwarded me news articles about healthcare policy, adding thoughtful comments that showed he was following the issues I worked on. Mom had started volunteering at a local community health fair, wanting to understand patient services from the ground up. Carmen had been accepted into a graduate program in public health administration, planning to build her own career in healthcare policy. The birthday party confrontation that had started this transformation now felt like ancient history, but its lessons remained relevant. I'd learned that family recognition, while gratifying, couldn't be the primary motivation for meaningful work. The work had to matter for its own sake, with or without an audience. But I'd also learned that when family members do finally see and understand your achievements, their support can amplify your impact in unexpected ways. Dad's pride in my work had led him to volunteer with a local organization serving unemployed factory workers, helping them navigate healthcare options during career transitions. Mom's newfound understanding of community health had made her an advocate for preventive care in her social circle. Carmen's professional growth had created a model for other family members considering career changes toward service-oriented work. The ripple effects of being truly seen and supported by family extended far beyond personal satisfaction. When the people who know you best understand and value your work, they become ambassadors for the mission in ways that formal marketing and public relations never could achieve. That evening, as I reviewed policy briefs in my federal office, overlooking the city where I'd grown up, I reflected on the journey from overlooked daughter to recognized policy leader. The path had been longer and more complicated than I'd expected, full of professional challenges, family dynamics, and personal growth that couldn't have been predicted or planned. But sitting in that office, with the authority to influence healthcare policy for millions of Americans, knowing that my family finally understood and supported the work that drove me, I felt a completeness that went beyond career achievement. I'd built something meaningful that would outlast any individual recognition or family approval, but having both the meaningful work and the family understanding created a foundation for the next phase of my career that felt both solid and inspiring. The quiet daughter who'd been dismissed as the family disappointment had become a policy leader whose work influenced healthcare access across the country. But more importantly, she'd become someone who understood that success isn't about proving critics wrong or gaining overdue recognition. Success is about building something that matters, maintaining your integrity throughout the process, and creating space for other people to grow and contribute in their own ways. Carmen's text that evening captured the evolution perfectly. Saw your name in the Federal Register today. Still can't believe my sister writes healthcare policy for the entire country. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to tell you that her diabetes is under control thanks to the screening program. She says you're still not the government lady. You're the lady who became the government to help people like her. The message reminded me why the work mattered more than the recognition, why policy change mattered more than personal advancement, and why building systems that actually helped people was more important than building a career that impressed people. But it also reminded me that having family members who understood and supported that mission made every challenge easier and every success more meaningful. The birthday party that had started with an insult about being the family disappointment had led to a transformation that benefited not just me, but everyone who'd been willing to grow, learn, and find their own way to contribute to something bigger than themselves. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 year after my birthday party revelation. I was reviewing budget allocations for our new maternal health initiative when my assistant Jennifer knocked on my office door with an expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between excitement and disbelief. "Rachel, there's someone from the White House Office of Presidential Personnel on line 1. She says it's regarding a potential appointment to the President's Council on Community Health Innovation." I stared at her for a moment, certain I'd misheard. The President's Council was the highest advisory body for healthcare policy in the country, composed of 12 experts who directly influenced federal health initiatives. Members were typically seasoned professionals with decades of experience, not regional directors still in their 20s. "Are you sure she said the White House?" I asked, reaching for the phone with hands that were suddenly unsteady. The conversation that followed was surreal in its calm professionalism. Margaret Chen from the Office of Presidential Personnel explained that my congressional testimony had caught the attention of several senior advisors, and my subsequent work on cross-border healthcare initiatives had positioned me as exactly the kind of innovative thinker the administration wanted on the council. "Ms. Martinez, your approach to community-based healthcare delivery has been cited in 3 major policy papers this year. The President is specifically interested in your rural access programs and your success in building partnerships between federal agencies and grassroots organizations." The formal language couldn't disguise the magnitude of what she was describing. If appointed to the council,
I would be advising the President of the United States on healthcare policy that affected millions of Americans. My voice would be heard in the Oval Office. My recommendations would influence decisions at the highest levels of government. The position would require relocating to Washington, D.C., and committing to a 2-year term, Dr. Chen continued. You'd maintain your current salary level, but you'd be working directly with the Secretary of Health and Human Services on priority initiatives. Are you interested in being considered? Interested felt like an inadequate word for the opportunity being offered. This was the kind of position I'd dreamed about during late nights in graduate school, the chance to influence healthcare policy at a scale that could transform entire systems rather than just individual programs. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm very interested. The vetting process would take 6 weeks, involving background checks, interviews with senior staff, and a formal presentation to the selection committee. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a certainty that this opportunity was meant for me, that every challenge and achievement of the past 5 years had been preparing me for exactly this moment. The first person I wanted to call was Carmen. Our relationship had evolved into something I'd never expected: genuine professional collaboration and personal friendship. She'd been promoted twice at Community Health Partners and was now managing patient advocacy programs across 3 facilities. Her insights into community needs had influenced several of my policy recommendations, and her success had proven that meaningful career transformation was possible at any stage of life. Carmen, you're not going to believe what just happened, I said when she answered her phone. Did you get that federal appointment you were hoping for? Her immediate understanding of the significance surprised me. A year ago, Carmen wouldn't have known what a federal appointment meant or why it mattered. Now she followed healthcare policy developments with the attention of someone whose daily work was affected by government decisions. Potentially, the White House wants to interview me for the President's Council on Community Health Innovation. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Carmen's voice came back thick with emotion. Rachel, that's the President. You could be advising the actual president. It's just an interview at this point, but yes, if it works out, I'd be part of the team that helps shape national healthcare policy. Holy shit, Carmen whispered, then immediately caught herself. Sorry, I know you don't like when I swear about your work stuff, but Rachel, this is incredible. When do you find out? The process takes about 6 weeks, but Carmen, if this happens, it means moving to DC for 2 years. It means leaving Community Health Partners and stepping away from the programs we've built here. The reality of what the appointment would require was beginning to sink in. I'd spent 5 years building relationships, developing programs, and establishing trust within communities across the Southwest. Leaving that work would mean starting over in a completely different environment, working with federal bureaucracy instead of grassroots organizations. But think about what you could accomplish in DC, Carmen said, her voice growing stronger. All those programs you've created here, all those innovations you've developed, imagine scaling them up nationally. You could help communities like ours across the entire country. Her perspective clarified something I'd been struggling with. This wasn't about abandoning the work I'd built. It was about expanding its impact beyond anything I could achieve regionally. The programs Carmen and I had developed in East LA could become models for similar communities in Detroit, Phoenix, Houston, and dozens of other cities. That evening, I drove to my parents' house to share the news in person. The dynamic of these conversations had changed dramatically over the past year. Dad no longer struggled to understand what I did for work. He followed healthcare policy news and often sent me articles with thoughtful commentary. Mom had become one of my most insightful sounding boards, asking questions that helped me think through complex problems from different angles. I found them in the kitchen, working together on Mom's famous tamales, while watching the evening news. The domestic scene felt perfectly normal, until I remembered I was about to tell them their daughter might be moving to Washington to advise the president.
I have some news to share, I began, settling into the kitchen chair where I'd done homework throughout high school. Dad turned down the volume on the television and gave me his full attention. Mom wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from me. The respectful focus they gave to my announcements now was such a contrast to the distracted politeness of years past. The White House called today. They want to interview me for an appointment to the President's Council on Community Health Innovation. The words hung in the air for a moment before Dad's face broke into the widest smile I'd ever seen from him. The White House. Mija, are you telling me the president wants you to work for him? It's an advisory position, not a staff job. But yes, if appointed, I'd be helping to develop national healthcare policy. Mom's reaction was quieter, but more emotional. Tears gathered in her eyes as she reached across the table to take my hands. Rachel, do you remember when you were little, and you used to play doctor with your dolls? You'd line them up and pretend to give them medicine and make them feel better. I never imagined that little girl would grow up to help make medicine policy for the whole country. The memory was vivid and poignant. I had spent countless hours as a child playing elaborate games where I was a doctor or nurse, always focused on healing and helping rather than the dramatic scenarios that interested other kids. Even then, apparently, I'd been drawn to healthcare as service rather than profession. What would this mean for your work here? Dad asked, his practical nature asserting itself. Would you have to give up everything you've built at Community Health Partners? I'd take a leave of absence, and the position is only for 2 years. But yes, it would mean stepping away from direct program management and moving into policy development at the federal level. The conversation that followed revealed how much my parents had grown in their understanding of my career trajectory. They asked sophisticated questions about the political implications of federal service, the potential for policy implementation, and the long-term impact on my professional development. These weren't people trying to understand their daughter's work. These were people who understood it and wanted to help her think through a complex decision. The 6 weeks of the vetting process passed in a blur of interviews, background checks and presentation. I met with senior staff from the Department of Health and Human Services, policy experts from various think tanks, and current council members who grilled me on everything from rural healthcare delivery to immigration policy implications. The most challenging interview was with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the current council chair who had spent 20 years in federal service and was known for her rigorous standards. She questioned me intensively about my experience with federal bureaucracy, my ability to work within political constraints, and my strategies for building consensus among diverse stakeholders. Martinez, she said toward the end of our meeting, you have impressive accomplishments for someone your age. But advising the president requires a different skill set than managing regional programs. How do you know you're ready for this level of responsibility? The question was fair and direct. I thought about the birthday party confrontation that had revealed my family's misconceptions about my work, about the years of building programs without recognition, about the steady progression from program assistant to regional director, to this moment. Mitchell, I've spent 5 years learning that effective healthcare policy requires understanding both the human impact and the system's implications of every decision. I've worked directly with patients, medical providers, community leaders, and government officials. I've seen what works and what doesn't work when policy meets reality. I think that breadth of experience rather than just depth in federal bureaucracy might be exactly what the council needs. Her slight smile suggested my answer had been more effective than I'd hoped. 3 weeks later, the call came. Dr. Chen, from the White House Personnel Office, delivered the news with characteristic efficiency. Ms. Martinez, the president would like to offer you a position on the Council on Community Health Innovation. Are you prepared to accept? The moment felt surreal and inevitable at the same time. Yes, I accept. Excellent. We'll need you to start in 6 weeks. Welcome to federal service. The logistics of transitioning to Washington were complex but manageable. Community Health Partners agreed to a 2-year leave of absence, allowing me to return to my regional position if I chose. Carmen was promoted to interim program director for the East LA facility, an advancement that reflected her genuine professional growth over the past year. But the emotional preparation for this transition was more challenging than the practical arrangements. I was leaving not just a job but a community where I'd spent 5 years building relationships and trust. The patients who knew me, the medical providers I'd worked with, the policy advocates who'd become collaborators, All of these connections would be suspended while I moved into a completely different professional world. The farewell reception at Community Health Partners drew over 200 people, including patients, staff members, community leaders, and government officials I'd worked with over the years. Dr. Restrepo spoke about my contributions to the organization, but the comments that moved me most came from patients whose lives had been affected by programs I'd helped develop. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman Carmen had mentioned months earlier, approached me with tears in her eyes. Dr. Rachel, my granddaughter wants to study medicine because of the health program you brought to our school. You changed our whole family's life. The impact was personal and immediate in ways that policy papers and budget reports could never capture. This woman's granddaughter would become a doctor because of a teenage pregnancy prevention program I'd designed 3 years earlier. The ripple effects of effective policy work extended far beyond what any bureaucratic measurement could quantify. Carmen's speech at the reception surprised everyone, including me. She'd become a confident public speaker through her patient advocacy work, but addressing a crowd of healthcare professionals was something new for her. A year and a half ago, I thought my sister Rachel worked at a small clinic, doing unimportant paperwork. I was wrong about almost everything. Rachel doesn't just work in healthcare. She creates healthcare access where none existed before. She doesn't just serve patients. She builds systems that serve entire communities, and now she's going to Washington to do that same work for the whole country. She paused, looking directly at me. Rachel taught me that meaningful work isn't about getting recognition or praise. It's about building something that matters more than your own ego. She's the reason I found my calling in this field, and she's the reason I believe that one person really can change systems that seem too big to move. The speech captured something essential about the relationship between individual work and systemic change that I'd been trying to articulate for years. Effective healthcare policy wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic reforms. It was about steady, thoughtful work that built better systems one program at a time. My first day at the White House complex was both thrilling and intimidating. The security clearance process, the formal protocols, the weight of walking into buildings where decisions affecting millions of people were made daily, all of it felt like stepping into a world I'd only seen in movies, but the actual work felt surprisingly familiar. The President's Council met twice weekly to review policy proposals, assess program effectiveness, and develop recommendations for federal healthcare initiatives. The scale was larger and the political implications more complex, but the fundamental work of analyzing problems, developing solutions, and building consensus was exactly what I'd been doing for years. My first major contribution came during a discussion about rural healthcare access. Several council members were debating the effectiveness of mobile health units, citing studies that showed mixed results and questioning whether federal investment was justified. The issue isn't whether mobile health units work, I interjected during a brief pause in the discussion. The issue is how they're implemented and integrated with existing community resources. I've seen mobile units fail because they operated independently, and I've seen them succeed because they were part of comprehensive community health strategy. The room fell silent. 12 senior policy experts turning their attention to the youngest person at the table. Council Chair Dr. Mitchell nodded encouragingly. In the Southwest, we developed a model that combines mobile units with community health worker programs, telehealth capabilities, and partnerships with local social service organizations. The result isn't just better health outcomes, it's community capacity building that continues long after the mobile unit leaves. Over the next hour, I walked the council through specific examples, outcome data, and implementation strategies that could be adapted for rural communities across the country. By the end of the discussion, 3 council members were taking detailed notes, and Dr. Mitchell was asking about the possibility of presenting our model to the full cabinet. That evening, I called Carmen from my small apartment near DuPont Circle. I think I'm going to like this job, I told her. How was the first day with the big shots? They're not as intimidating as I expected, and they actually listened when I talked about our programs. I think some of the work we did in LA might become national policy. Rachel, that's incredible. You're literally changing healthcare for the whole country now. The conversation reminded me why this transition felt right despite its challenges. The work Carmen and I had done together, the programs we'd developed, the communities we'd served. All of that experience was now being applied at a scale that could benefit millions of families facing similar challenges. 6 months into my council service, I was invited to present at my first cabinet meeting. The topic was rural healthcare infrastructure, and my presentation focused on community-based models that had proven effective in underserved areas across the Southwest. Sitting in the cabinet room of the White House, addressing the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Agriculture, and other senior officials about healthcare policy I'd helped develop, I felt a profound sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement. But the moment that crystallized the significance of this work came during the question period, when the Secretary of Agriculture asked about agricultural worker health program. I was able to describe specific initiatives we'd implemented, real families we'd served, and measurable outcomes that demonstrated both human impact and policy effectiveness. Secretary Williams, these aren't theoretical programs. I've worked directly with the farm worker families who benefit from mobile health services. I've seen children receive their first comprehensive medical exams through school-based clinics. I've watched chronic disease management programs help elderly agricultural workers maintain their health and independence. The personal knowledge, the direct experience, the ability to connect policy decisions with human faces. This was what I brought to federal service that couldn't be learned from reports or briefing. After the cabinet meeting, I walked through Lafayette Square in the early evening light, calling my parents to share what had happened. Mija, you presented to the president's cabinet. Dad's voice carried a mixture of pride and amazement that reminded me of his reaction to my first congressional testimony. The healthcare parts of the cabinet, yes, and Dad, they're going to implement some of our programs nationally. The work we did in East LA could help families in rural Texas, North Dakota, Mississippi, communities that face similar challenges, but have never had access to comprehensive healthcare services. Your mother is crying, Dad said, his own voice thick with emotion. She's so proud she can't even speak. That night, I sat in my DC apartment reviewing briefing materials for the next day's council meeting, but my mind kept returning to the journey that had brought me to this point. The birthday party confrontation that revealed my family's misconception, the years of building programs without recognition, the steady progression from regional work to national influence. But most importantly, I thought about the patients and communities whose needs had driven every policy decision, every program development, every long night spent writing grants and developing strategies. Mrs. Rodriguez and her granddaughter, who was now pre-med at UCLA, the migrant worker families who had reliable health care access for the first time in their lives, the community health workers who'd been trained and empowered to serve their neighbors. Policy work at this level could feel abstract, removed from the human impact of government decisions. But I'd brought with me the faces, voices, and stories of real people whose lives were improved by effective healthcare programs. That connection to human impact, that understanding of how policy translated into daily reality for vulnerable families, was what made the work meaningful, regardless of the setting or scope. A year into my council service, I received an unexpected call from Carmen. She'd been accepted into a doctoral program in health policy at UCLA, and wanted to discuss her dissertation research focus. I want to study the implementation of federal healthcare programs at the community level, she told me. Specifically, I want to research how federal policy gets translated into local programs, and what factors determine whether those programs actually serve the communities they're designed to help. The research focus was sophisticated and important, but it also represented something more personal. Carmen had found her own path to meaningful work in healthcare policy, independent of my influence, but informed by the experiences we'd shared. That's excellent research focus, Carmen. Have you thought about which communities you want to study? Actually, I want to start with East LA, with community health partners. I want to document how the programs you developed there are being adapted and implemented in other communities now that they're part of federal policy.
The circle was completing itself in ways I hadn't anticipated. The work I'd done at the community level was becoming national policy through my council service. Carmen was now studying how that national policy was being implemented back at the community level. The connection between grassroots work and federal policy was becoming a living laboratory for research that could improve both. I think that's brilliant, I told her, and I think your perspective as someone who's worked both as a patient advocate and as a policy researcher will give you insights that purely academic researchers might miss. 2 years into my council appointment, as I prepared to decide whether to extend my federal service or return to community health partners, I received a letter that crystallized everything I'd learned about the relationship between recognition, family support, and meaningful work. The letter came from a high school student named Maria Rodriguez Williams in Fresno, California. She'd learned about my work through a school presentation about healthcare careers and wanted to share her own story. Dear Martinez, the letter began, I am writing to thank you for the mobile health program that comes to our school. Last year, the program detected a heart condition I didn't know I had. The surgery to correct it was successful, and now I'm healthy and planning to study medicine in college. My grandmother always told me that education was the way to help our community, but I never knew how to connect what I learned with helping people I cared about. Your work showed me that healthcare policy can be a way to serve communities like mine. The letter went on to describe Maria's plans to study public health, her interest in policy development, and her goal of working with underserved communities. She concluded by saying, I want to follow your path of using education and policy to create healthcare access for families who need it most. Reading that letter in my White House office, I understood that the most important measure of professional success wasn't personal recognition or career advancement. It was the ripple effect of effective work, the way meaningful programs inspired other people to find their own paths to service and contribution. Maria Rodriguez Williams in Fresno was connected to Miss Rodriguez in East LA, who was connected to Carmen's transformation, who was connected to my own journey from overlooked daughter to presidential advisor. The thread of healthcare access, community service, and policy development was weaving together lives and careers in ways that extended far beyond any individual achievement. That evening, I made my decision about extending my federal service. I would serve one additional year on the council, long enough to see the implementation of several major initiatives I'd helped develop. Then I would return to Community Health Partners, but in a new role, Director of Policy Development and Community Partnerships, a position that would allow me to bridge federal policy work with grassroots implementation. The decision felt right because it honored both the policy experience I'd gained and the community connections that had always driven my work. More importantly, it positioned me to mentor other young professionals who wanted to create change at the intersection of policy and practice. When I called my parents to share the decision, Dad's response captured something essential about the journey we'd all taken together. Misha, I'm proud of you for going to Washington, and I'll be proud of you for coming home. But I'm most proud that you never forgot why the work matters in the first place. The birthday party that had started with Carmen calling me the family disappointment had led to a transformation that benefited not just me, but everyone who'd been willing to grow, learn, and find their own way to contribute to something bigger than themselves. But the real legacy wasn't the titles, appointments, or recognition. It was the young women like Maria Rodriguez Williams who saw possibility in healthcare policy work, the families whose lives were improved by effective programs, and the communities that were stronger because dedicated people had chosen service over self-interest. Success, I'd learned, wasn't about proving critics wrong or gaining overdue recognition. Success was about building work that mattered, maintaining integrity throughout the process, and creating space for other people to find their own paths to meaningful contribution. The quiet daughter who'd been dismissed as a disappointment had become a policy leader whose work influenced healthcare access across the nation. But more importantly, she'd become someone who understood that the work itself was always more important than any recognition it might generate, and that the highest form of success was inspiring others to build something meaningful in their own communities and career. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.